The air in the cardiac intensive care unit of Metropolitan General Hospital was a carefully curated symphony of manufactured calm. It was a place of hushed tones, the gentle, rhythmic sigh of ventilators, and the steady, electronic pulse of life monitoring equipment. The smell was a sterile cocktail of antiseptic, bleach, and the faint, metallic tang of human fear, a scent that clung to the starched white linens and the polished linoleum floors. In this precisely controlled environment, senior nurse Clara Reed moved like a ghost, a silent, efficient presence who seemed to melt into the background, becoming just another part of the machinery of healing. For 15 years, she had been a fixture on this ward, her quiet professionalism as reliable as the sunrise and just as often taken for granted. Clara was a woman carved from stillness. Her movements were economical, each step measured, each gesture possessing a purpose that bordered on the liturgical. When she checked a patient's intravenous line, her fingers did not fumble. They moved with a deft, practiced certainty that spoke of 1,000 repetitions. When she adjusted a pillow, it was with a fluid grace that brought comfort without disruption. Her face, framed by wisps of brown hair that had long ago surrendered to gray at the temples, was a mask of placid neutrality. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, missed nothing. They saw the subtle twitch in a patient's hand, the faint sheen of sweat on a sleeping brow, the almost imperceptible flicker of anxiety in the eyes of a visiting family member. She was the unit's living database, a repository of unspoken symptoms and unvoiced fears. Her colleagues saw her as a fixture, dependable and unassuming. They saw the slight, almost unnoticeable limp in her right leg, which she dismissed with a wave of her hand as the lingering souvenir of a clumsy fall down a flight of stairs years ago. They saw the network of faint, silvery scars that crisscrossed the backs of her hands and snaked up her forearms, which she explained away with a quiet story about a grease fire in her first apartment. These stories were accepted without question, for Clara Reed was not a woman who invited curiosity. Her quietness was a wall, her gentleness a form of camouflage. She existed in the space between being essential and being invisible. Younger nurses, fresh from their studies and full of ambition, would rush past her, their energy a stark contrast to her deliberate calm. They were the bright, noisy engines of the ward. She was the silent, steady gyroscope that kept it all from spinning into chaos. Yet, there were moments, fleeting and easily missed, that hinted at something more beneath the placid surface. A new, state-of-the-art defibrillator. A complex machine that had the younger, tech-savvy residents scratching their heads became flawlessly operational in her hands after a single, cursory glance at the manual. During a chaotic code blue, when a patient's heart stuttered to a halt and panic began to fray the edges of the room's composure, Clara's voice would cut through the noise, not loud, but clear and absolute. 2 milligrams epinephrine, she would say, her eyes locked on the monitor, her tone leaving no room for argument. She analyzed the frantic squiggles on the screen, not with the practiced eye of a nurse, but with the cold, detached precision of a cryptographer deciphering a fatal code. These instances were sparks in the darkness, glimpses of a different person wearing Clara's face, a person who understood chaos not as something to be feared, but as a problem to be solved with ruthless efficiency. The most recent charge nurse position had opened up 3 weeks prior. It was a role Clara had quietly coveted for years, not for the authority or the minor increase in pay, but for the ability to implement changes she knew would improve patient outcomes, to streamline the very systems that often failed under pressure. She had submitted her application. As she had done 4 times before over the past decade, a slim file containing 15 years of flawless performance reviews and letters of commendation from doctors who had long since retired. She knew, even as she slid the folder into the designated slot, that it was a futile gesture. The rejection came not in a sterile, impersonal email, but in a public execution of her hopes, delivered by the very woman who held the power of promotion in her manicured hands. Charge nurse Brenda Gable was a creature of a different ecosystem. Where Clara was quiet efficiency, Brenda was loud ambition. She wore her authority like a designer suit, tailored to impress the hospital's board of directors and the wealthy donors who frequented the private suites on the top floor. Her hair was a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde, her voice a sharp, grating instrument she used to dissect the shortcomings of her subordinates. She valued metrics over morale, budgets over bedside manner. Brenda had cornered Clara at the central nursing station during the midday shift change, a time of maximum traffic and visibility. She held Clara's application folder between two fingers as if it were a piece of contaminated tissue. "Clara," she began, her voice loud enough for the half-dozen other nurses and 2 junior residents present to hear. "I've reviewed your application for the charge nurse position." She paused, letting the silence hang, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. "And while your reliability is certainly appreciated," the word was delivered as if it were an insult, "this role requires a certain dynamic quality. It requires leadership. Clara, the ability to inspire, to innovate, not just to show up every day." She tapped the folder against the counter. "We need a forward thinker, someone who can interface with the board, someone who projects confidence." Her eyes flickered over Clara's simple, worn scrubs, her placid expression. "Perhaps in a few more years, when you've had a chance to develop more of a command presence." She dropped the folder onto the counter with a soft thud of finality, turned on her heel, and strode away, leaving Clara standing in a widening pool of silence and humiliation. The younger nurses looked away, their discomfort a palpable thing. Clara simply picked up the folder, her face an unreadable mask, and slid it into the recycling bin. Inside, a cold, hard knot formed in her stomach, a feeling she had not truly felt in 15 years. It was the feeling of being underestimated, and it was as familiar and unwelcome as an old wound. In the weeks that followed, Brenda Gable, perhaps sensing a need to reassert her dominance after the display, seemed to take a perverse pleasure in assigning Clara the most thankless tasks. She was tasked with inventory, a tedious job in the windowless supply rooms in the hospital's basement. She was assigned the most difficult and demanding patients, the ones whose families were prone to litigation, or whose conditions were a messy, frustrating puzzle. Clara accepted each assignment without complaint, her stoicism an infuriating, impenetrable shield against Brenda's petty tyrannies. She performed each duty with the same meticulous care she brought to everything, her quiet competence a silent rebuke to the woman who saw her as nothing more than a functional, replaceable part. Then came the day the sky fell on the city. The first reports were a confused jumble of noise on the news channel playing silently in the staff break room, a corporate helicopter, a sudden mechanical failure, a catastrophic descent into the heart of the financial district. Then the calls began, a cascade of alerts that turned the hospital's controlled environment into a vortex of organized chaos. The words mass casualty incident crackled over the intercom, and the ER became a war zone. The scent of antiseptic was overwhelmed by the raw, coppery smell of blood and the acrid tang of burnt fuel that clung to the clothes of the first responders. Victims arrived in a steady, horrifying stream, their business suits and expensive dresses shredded and stained, their bodies a testament to the brutal physics of gravity and impact. The staff moved with a frantic energy, a desperate dance of triage and treatment. Amidst the chaos, Clara was an island of calm. She moved through the ER, not rushing, but with a focused intensity that drew the eye. She was not panicking, she was assessing, categorizing, prioritizing. Her mind, long accustomed to the steady rhythm of the IQ, was now processing a dozen critical data points at once. The shallow breathing of a man with a crushed chest, the unnaturally pale skin of a woman with internal bleeding, the telltale signs of shock in a young stockbroker who insisted he was fine. Brenda Gable was in her element, but it was an element of performative command. She barked orders, her voice shrill, directing traffic and ensuring that the most important victim, a senior executive from the Downed Helicopters Corporation named Mr. Sterling, received the immediate attention of the chief of surgery. He was a man whose company had just donated a new wing to the hospital, a fact Brenda was acutely aware of. She hovered around his gurney, a sycophantic whirlwind of concern, ensuring his comfort while other, more grievously injured patients waited. It was then that the second wave of the crisis arrived, not with the wail of a city ambulance, but with the low, thrumming beat of military-grade rotor blades. A sleek, black helicopter, unmarked and menacing, descended onto the hospital's rooftop helipad. Moments later, the priority elevator doors opened directly into the ER trauma bay, and two men in dark suits and earpieces emerged, flanking a gurney. They moved with a chilling, synchronized purpose, their eyes sweeping the room, assessing threats that were not there. On the gurney lay a man built like a mountain, his body a landscape of corded muscle now ravaged by violence. He was covered in blood, his tactical gear cut away by field medics to reveal multiple grievous gunshot wounds. Master Chief Petty Officer Jack Corrigan, one of the suits, announced to the nearest doctor, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Multiple GSWs to the chest and abdomen. He's been stabilized for transport, but he's crashing. The hospital was now on a soft lockdown, the men in suits quietly and efficiently securing the perimeter of the ER, their presence a stark and unsettling intrusion into the civilian world. Brenda Gable, seeing the disruption, marched over, her face a mask of indignation. "This is a civilian hospital. You can't just," she began. But the man in the suit simply looked through her, his gaze utterly dismissive, and she fell silent. Clara watched them wheel the soldier into Trauma Bay 3. She saw the rapid infuser bag of O-negative blood running wide open, the strained look on the young resident's face as he struggled to find a viable vein for a central line. She saw the monitor above the gurney, the numbers blinking a frantic, failing rhythm. The soldier's blood pressure was plummeting, his heart rate a chaotic, desperate flutter. Tachycardia sliding into bradycardia. Attention pneumothorax, she diagnosed instantly, her eyes catching the almost imperceptible distension of the veins in his neck and the slight asymmetrical rise and fall of his chest. The resident was fumbling, overwhelmed. The attending physician was tied up with Mr. Sterling. The soldier was dying. And in that moment, something inside Clara Reed broke. It was not a snap, but a slow, deliberate unlocking of a door that had been sealed for 15 years. The quiet nurse, the reliable cog, the woman who endured humiliation with placid grace, receded. In her place stood someone else entirely. The memories, the training, the muscle memory honed in the crucible of places far more terrifying than a civilian ER, rose not as a flood, but as a cold, clear tide. She saw not a patient, but a friendly casualty. She saw not a hospital, but a forward operating base. She saw not a crisis, but a mission. She crossed the floor of the ER in 10 measured strides. Her limp was gone. Her posture had changed, her shoulders squared, her back ramrod straight. She did not ask for permission. She did not consult. She arrived at Trauma Bay 3 and took command. "Get out of the way," she said, her voice low, but carrying a new and terrifying authority. The young resident, startled, looked up at her, and what he saw in her eyes made him step back without a word. "I need a 14-gauge needle, a chest tube tray, and 4 more units of O-neg on a pressure bag," she snapped, her words precise and clipped. "And get me Dr. Evans. Tell him it's a Kabul special. Now." The term was alien to the ER staff, a piece of jargon from a world they could not imagine, but the urgency in her voice was a language they all understood. A nearby nurse, a woman who had worked with Clara for 5 years, simply stared, mouth agape. "Clara, what are you, move?" Clara's voice was a physical force, a crack of thunder in the chaotic room. The nurse flinched and ran. Clara turned her attention to the dying soldier. Her scarred hands, the ones she claimed were burned in a kitchen fire, moved with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. She ripped open a packet containing the 14-gauge needle, located the second intercostal space on the soldier's chest with 2 practiced fingers, and with a single, powerful thrust, drove the needle into his chest cavity. There was a sudden, explosive hiss of escaping air, and the numbers on the monitor above them flickered, and then, miraculously, began to stabilize. His blood pressure ticked up a few points. His heart rate settled from a frantic flutter to a desperate, but steady, beat. Brenda Gable, her face a mottled canvas of fury and disbelief, finally broke through the small crowd that had gathered. "Nurse Reed, what in God's name do you think you are doing? You are not a doctor. You will be fired for this. Step away from that patient right now," she shrieked, her voice cracking with rage. Clara did not even turn to look at her. Her focus was absolute. Her world narrowed to the man on the gurney and the blinking lights of the monitor. "Somebody shut her up, or I will," Clara said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. One of the men in suits stepped forward, placed a firm hand on Brenda's arm, and quietly, but irrevocably, guided her away. He did not say a word, but his grip was iron, and Brenda's protests died in her throat, replaced by a choked, sputtering sound of impotent rage. Clara, now assisted by the arriving trauma surgeon, Dr. Evans, who had taken one look at the situation and recognized the work of a seasoned professional, continued her work. They inserted the chest tube, a bloody and brutal procedure that Clara directed with the calm of a master craftsman. She called out vitals, anticipated the surgeon's needs, and identified a secondary bleeding source in the abdomen that everyone else had missed. She was not a nurse assisting a doctor. She was a peer, a partner in the violent, intricate ballet of saving a life. The other nurses and doctors stood frozen, watching in a state of suspended disbelief. They were witnessing the complete and total deconstruction of the woman they thought they knew. The quiet, gentle Clara Reed had vanished, and in her place was this force of nature, this warrior. Hours later, Master Chief Petty Officer Jack Corrigan was stable, resting in the ICU. The immediate crisis had passed. He was alive, a fact that every medical professional who had witnessed the events in the ER attributed to one person. Clara had not left his side. Her shift had ended 6 hours ago, but she remained, a silent sentinel by his bed, watching the monitors, her face once again a calm, neutral mask, though the storm was still visible in the depths of her eyes. Brenda Gable, seething with a mixture of fury and terror, was in her office, furiously typing a report that would see Clara not just fired, but stripped of her nursing license. Insubordination. Practicing medicine without a license. Reckless endangerment. The charges mounted, each one a nail in the coffin of Clara's career. The ICU was quiet again, the familiar symphony of beeps and sighs restored. Clara was adjusting the drip rate on Corrigan's medication when his eyelids fluttered. He was heavily sedated, still intubated, but a flicker of consciousness was returning. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, struggled to focus. They swept the room, confused, and then they landed on her. And they stopped. A profound, shocking clarity entered his gaze. Recognition, he knew her. The confusion on his face was replaced by something else, something akin to reverence. He fought against the heavy pull of the drugs, a primal urgency driving him. His hand, a slab of thick muscle covered in IV lines and sensors, shot out with surprising speed and latched onto her forearm, his grip firm, desperate. Brenda Gable chose that exact moment to make her move. She strode into the ICU room, a sheaf of papers in her hand, flanked by two burly hospital security guards. "Clara Reed," she announced, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. "This is your formal notice of termination. Security will escort you from the premises. Your actions were reckless, illegal, and have put this entire hospital at risk." She was about to continue her tirade when she saw the patient, the critically wounded soldier, awake and gripping Clara's arm. His eyes were wide, fixed on Clara, and his other hand was moving, tapping a frantic, rhythmic pattern against the back of her wrist. Tap, tap, tap. Da, da, da. Tap, it was nonsense to Brenda, the meaningless twitching of a brain-damaged patient. But Clara understood. "Valkyrie? Is it you?" The question was sent in the staccato language of Morse code, a language of spies and soldiers. Clara's face remained a mask of professional calm, but for a single, heart-stopping second, she closed her eyes. Then she opened them and gave the barest, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, just as Brenda was about to order the guards to forcibly remove Clara, the main elevator at the end of the hall dinged. The sound was different, heavier, more authoritative than the usual chime. The doors slid open not to reveal a doctor or a visiting family, but 4 men in the dress uniform of the United States Army Military Police, their white gloves immaculate, their faces grim and set. They stepped out and took up positions on either side of the elevator, a silent, imposing honor guard. A moment later, a man stepped out from between them, and the entire atmosphere of the floor changed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a shock of silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. The 4 stars on the epaulets of his immaculate uniform glittered under the harsh fluorescent lights. This was General Marcus Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man whose face was familiar from news broadcasts and congressional hearings, a man who commanded armies. He strode down the hallway, his polished shoes making no sound on the linoleum, his presence sucking the very air from the corridor. The hospital administrator, Mr. Fitzwilliam, scurried behind him, his face pale and sweating. General Thorne ignored the administrator. He ignored the stunned nurses and doctors who had flattened themselves against the walls as if to avoid his gravitational pull. His eyes, the color of cold steel, swept the hallway and found their target. He walked directly to the door of ICU Room 4, where Brenda Gable stood, frozen in a tableau of horrified confusion. He did not look at her. He looked past her, his gaze locking onto the unassuming nurse in the worn scrubs. His voice, when he spoke, was not a shout. It was something far more powerful. It was the sound of absolute, unquestionable authority, a voice that could launch fleets and move divisions, and it filled the sudden, profound silence of the ICU. "Captain," he boomed, the single word echoing like a cannon shot. "Captain Reed, it has been a long time." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Brenda Gable's jaw dropped, a comical, cartoonish expression of shock on her face. "Captain?" She looked from the 4-star general to the quiet nurse she had just tried to fire, her mind utterly failing to bridge the chasm between the two realities. General Thorne finally acknowledged her presence, his eyes flicking to her for a brief, dismissive moment before turning to the assembled staff, who were now peering from doorways, drawn by the incredible drama. He pointed a single, powerful finger towards the bed where Jack Corrigan lay. 15 years ago, the general began, his voice a low rumble of thunder, in a godforsaken corner of the Kunar Valley in Afghanistan. Master Chief Corrigan's SEAL team was ambushed. They walked into a kill box so perfect it should have been their grave. They were pinned down, outnumbered 10-1, with half their unit wounded and their communications jammed. Command wrote them off. They were listed as unrecoverable assets, a military euphemism for dead men. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. But one person disagreed with that assessment. His eyes found Clara's again, and this time there was a warmth in them, a profound and abiding respect. A combat medic, attached to a Tier 1 unit so secret that its name is not spoken above a whisper even within the Pentagon, went in for them. Her call sign was Valkyrie. At the name, Jack Corrigan, still holding Clara's arm, squeezed it tightly, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "She went in alone," Thorne continued, his voice rising with passion. "Under the cover of darkness, carrying nothing but a medical pack and her rifle. For 72 hours, she held that perimeter. She moved under constant, withering fire, dragging the wounded to cover, stabilizing men who should have died on that mountain. She patched up bullet wounds with nothing but quick clot and sheer force of will. She directed the fire of the men who could still fight. And she single-handedly held off an enemy assault on their position with nothing but a rifle she picked up from a fallen soldier and an inhuman amount of courage." Thorne took a step closer, his gaze sweeping over the dumbfounded faces of the hospital staff. He gently took Clara's hand, the one not being held by the Master Chief, and held it up for all to see, turning it over to display the web of silvery scars. "These are not from a kitchen fire," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the hallway. "They are from her pulling men from the burning wreckage of a downed Black Hawk helicopter that tried to reinforce them. She took 3 bullets to the leg and chest, and more shrapnel than the surgeons could count, but she refused evacuation until every last man in that unit was airlifted out." He let her hand go. "That woman," he declared, his voice once again a booming proclamation, "is Captain Clara Reed. She is a former Special Operations Surgical Team leader, a qualified Army Ranger, and the recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and 2 Purple Hearts. She is not just a nurse. She is one of the single greatest heroes this nation has produced in the last 50 years." The silence that followed was absolute. A profound, deafening void where the normal sounds of the hospital should have been. Every person in that hallway was locked in a state of shock, their minds struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet, overlooked nurse with the legendary warrior the general had just described. Then, Thorne's icy gaze fell upon Brenda Gable. He took the sheaf of papers from her unresisting fingers and glanced at the top page. His expression hardened, becoming a mask of cold fury. "Termination notice?" he said, his voice dangerously low. "For insubordination? For saving the life of a man your staff had left to die?" He looked from Brenda to the trembling hospital administrator, "Mr. Fitzwilliam." "Mr. Fitzwilliam," he said, his tone deceptively calm. "This hospital currently holds over $100 million in research and treatment contracts with the Department of Defense. As of this moment, every single one of those contracts is under immediate and hostile review, pending an investigation into the professional conduct and competence of your senior staff." Fitzwilliam's face turned the color of old parchment. He looked as if he might faint. "General, I assure you, this is all a terrible misunderstanding." "No," Thorne cut him off. "The misunderstanding was that you and your staff thought you knew who you were dealing with." He turned his full, wrathful attention back to Brenda. "As for you, madam," he said, crumpling the termination papers in his fist, "you will not be firing Captain Reed. You, however, will be spending the foreseeable future explaining your actions, not to a hospital board, but to a federal oversight committee with full subpoena power. I imagine the Department of Justice will also be interested in any institutional practices that lead to the negligent care of active duty military personnel. Have a nice day." Brenda Gable made a small, strangled sound and swayed on her feet, her face a ruin of shattered arrogance. Her career, her reputation, her entire world had been dismantled in less than 5 minutes. The spell of silence was finally broken. It started with a single person. A young nurse, one who had always been kind to Clara, began to clap. Her applause was tentative at first, then grew stronger. Another nurse joined in, then a doctor, then one of the security guards. Within seconds, the entire hallway was filled with a thunderous, rolling ovation. It was applause born of shock, of awe, and of a deep, profound respect for the quiet hero who had walked among them unseen for 15 long years. They were not clapping for a nurse. They were clapping for a legend. Through it all, Clara stood unmoved, her expression unchanging. The applause, the adulation, it was all noise. It meant nothing to her. Her eyes were on the soldier in the bed, Jack Corrigan, who was now weeping openly, tears of gratitude and relief tracking through the grime on his face. General Thorne stepped up to Clara, his expression softening. "It's time to come home, Captain," he said softly. "We need you." Clara looked at Corrigan, whose life she had just saved. She looked at the faces of the people she had worked with for a decade and a half, who were now looking at her as if for the first time. Then she looked at the general, the man who represented the only world where she had ever truly belonged, a world of sacrifice, discipline, and purpose. She gave a single, sharp nod. The decision was made. General Thorne gestured to his men, and they formed a protective cordon around her. As she was escorted towards the elevator, she did not look back. There was no triumph in her posture, no gloating in her eyes. There was only the quiet, weary dignity of a soldier who had finished one long, arduous tour of duty and was now being redeployed to the front lines. The doors of the elevator slid shut, sealing her away from the world that had never understood her, and taking her back to the one that desperately needed her. Back in the ICU, the applause slowly died down, leaving behind a new, respectful silence. The staff went back to their duties, but nothing was the same. They moved with a new awareness, their eyes scanning the faces of their colleagues, wondering what other heroes walked among them, hidden in plain sight. They learned that day that courage is not always loud, and that the deepest scars are often the ones you cannot see. The greatest heroes are not always the ones on the pedestals. Sometimes, they are the quiet ones, the ones who are overlooked, waiting for the one moment when the world needs them to be who they truly are.